Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy, EV miniseries, and today we are talking batteries. Neil, welcome back.
Hey Chris, how you doing?
Oh, I am super excited to figure out what we're going to talk about today because I think we have someone that does chemistry and batteries and all kinds of really cool stuff that make these EVs we've been talking about go.
Yeah, so this is like kind of central to the whole four-wheeled battery and computer equation that leads to electric vehicles. What is it that enables these things to be fueled differently and to move differently? Where have we come from? How have we got here? What does the future hold for the technology?
God,
So I
I thought
think
it was hydrogen. I didn't realize that batteries were even in the equation.
yeah, no, let's stick to batteries at the moment. We can do hydrogen in another episode. For the guests listening, we have a fabulous speaker today. His name is Dr. Euan McTurk, but I'm not going to steal his thunder. What I'd like to really know is, hey, Dr. Euan, who are you? Where did you come from? How did you get here?
Well, thanks for having us on the show. So, yeah, I'm Dr. Euan McTurk. I'm a consultant battery electrochemist based in Edinburgh. I'm the founder of Plug Life Consulting. But before that, I started my YouTube channel, which is Plug Life Television, which is all about battery tech, trying to distill complex electrochemistry into something that anyone can understand, and also busting various EV myths along the way. That was founded during my decade or so in academia and industry, working on next generation cell chemistries and also taking commercial lithium ion cells, a bit like this 18650 out of a Tesla Model S, and finding ways to insert extra electrodes and temperature sensors and so on, so we can find out in situ just how hard these batteries that are in EVs today can really be pushed, and then opening up that black box basically to see what are their true performance limits, what causes them to degrade in the real world, and how to stop them from degrading.
So that's fabulous. There's like 10 kicking off points in a conversation right there. But if we kind of roll backwards, we've been driving petrol and diesel vehicles for many years. You fill them up with a very highly energy dense material, you burn it inefficiently, and the vehicle moves. What changed to get us to the point whereby you could actually get enough energy into a battery to turn us into a world of, hey, electric vehicles can happen again? What's that journey been like to get us to the kind of stuff we see today?
Well, it's very much thanks to John Goodenough and his co-parts who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for the development of the lithium-ion cell. It was all about the energy density, how many kilowatt hours can you squeeze into a physical space or weight of battery. So you've got your gravimetric energy density and your volumetric energy density. Volumetric is particularly important for electric vehicles because you have a finite space into which to put these batteries. And what we actually found was that back at the turn of the 20th century, when there was actually a pretty even market split between petrol vehicles, steam cars, would you believe, and electric vehicles, that the old fashioned lead acid battery, the first rechargeable battery to be produced, actually had sufficient energy density to give 100 miles worth of range. But that's because speeds were very low and roads were terrible, so you wouldn't want to drive that fast anyway. So, 100-mile range out of a classic like a Detroit Electric or a Baker Electric. But obviously, then roads improved and speeds increased, and therefore you've got so much more energy demand to reach a certain speed. And ironically, it was the electric starter motor that killed the electric car for most of the 20th century until battery chemistry caught up. But it's absolutely the lithium ion cell that completely reset the playing field because it made EVs practical in a modern world.
And what we're really interested in there is the lithium ion cell enables us to get enough energy into a battery in a small enough space. We don't care too much about weight, but it enables a smaller space to enable us to get a vehicle to do some form of serviceable distance on modern roads. And we've
Absolutely,
been
yeah,
we've
yeah.
been kind of living with these lithium ion cells for a while now. A lot of talk about other bits that go into that lithium cell. What else is in there from a sort of chemical perspective?
So before we go into the shopping list of a lithium ion cell, it's worth pointing out that weight, obviously, it's good to try and keep that down. And we are seeing advances in gravimetric energy density, which means you don't need as big a battery pack, which means that actually some EVs are about the same weight or even lighter than their petrol or diesel counterparts. There's a lot of people who say, oh, EVs are big and heavy and damage the roads. A fully loaded Tesla Model X, big, obviously kind of flashy SUV, of an electric car is lighter than a Range Rover. So go figure. But the shopping list for a lithium ion cell. So obviously there's lithium in there. That's the thing that's going to be shuttling between the positive electrode and the negative electrode, the cathode and the anode. And that's what effectively stores the electrochemical energy. But in order to store that safely in a conventional lithium ion cell, you need something into which that lithium can pigeonhole or intercalate. And that is going to be your graphite, sometimes with a bit of silicon in there as well. So basically, carbon and silicon, they're, I mean, silicon sand, basically, is incredibly abundant. So that's not scary. You'll then have some sort of plasticky separator, plastic film that will be soaked in an organic electrolyte. Um, and that electrolyte will have a lithium salt in there. So again, kind of lithium based, not too scary. Then you've got your positive electrode, which is where the lithium is going to end up on the other side of the equation, and that's going to be a lithium heavy metal oxide of some description. So most of them contain cobalt. So, I mean, there are a couple that don't. Lithium iron phosphate, which we'll come back to later on, is a key example of that. But generally, in an EV, you will find lithium nickel manganese cobalt oxide or lithium nickel cobalt aluminium oxide if you have an American long range Tesla. But it's generally NMC that you find. So those are the key materials that are going in there.
And how
So
hard has it been to get these materials? I mean, you hear about the Congo, you hear
Mm.
about different areas, you see rare earths being there. You didn't mention there's others that I've heard in battery tech than the ones you've said. So, so
Yeah,
how's the supply chain for these rare earths, or is it just cobalt and lithium? I mean, what do you need?
so actually, rare earths, there's no rare earths in a lithium ion cell. The official definition of rare earths does not overlap on the periodic table with even the more obscure lithium ion based chemistries like LTO, lithium titanate, which is an alternative to your graphite anode, which allows stupidly high power density. In other words, it can dump a lot of power very quickly at the expense of energy density because its standard potential or its potential versus lithium, I should say, is higher than that of graphite. And when you're looking at the positive and the negative electrode of the battery, the potential difference between those two gives you your voltage, and the total energy contained is your capacity in ampere hours multiplied by voltage. So if you're reducing the voltage, then you end up with less energy. So that's why LTO isn't used in many EVs at the moment. It's very, very rare examples. That's gone completely down a rabbit hole there. But in terms of the supply of sort of raw materials that you'll find in an EV battery, the contentious ones are very much cobalt and lithium. And actually, nickel deserves a bit of attention there as well because we're using a lot more nickel now. We've upped the nickel content and vastly reduced the cobalt content. Cobalt has been reduced in modern EV batteries by about 90% over the past 10 to 12 years, and it continues to decline. There are already cobalt free versions of cobalt containing battery chemistries, which are close to commercialization. They're very much on the horizon. But yeah, cobalt the majority does come from Democratic Republic of Congo, but the majority of that comes from big open cast mines, which are run by the likes of Glencore, your big mining giants, and they have to do everything by the book, and that includes human rights, health and safety, absolutely minimum age requirements for working. You cannot be sending kids down mines. Where the headlines come in is artisanal mining, where locals will, in an attempt to make a living, they will do basically their own kind of hand dug mines, and in some cases so that's a very small fraction of DRC's cobalt output, and a very small percentage of those artisanal mines you may find kids in, and that's still too big a percentage. That needs to be eradicated. Everyone's in agreement, and that's why you've got the likes of the Fair Cobalt Alliance that's been formed, and that includes, off the top of my head, it includes Tesla, LG Chem. There's a couple of other big car and battery manufacturers in there, and a whole bunch of other cobalt users besides. And they are making sure that we're looking at fair wages, living wages, that we're looking at kids being in schools, not in mines, and that the health and safety conditions are ideal, of course. That we're not putting people in danger here. So that is something that is very much underway just now, and a lot of credit has to go to Fairphone, which is a little Dutch company that makes modular repairable smartphones. And they actually, whilst most car manufacturers were running away from DRC, or most battery manufacturers were running away from DRC trying to find supplies from somewhere with guaranteed ethics, etc., Fairphone was running straight into DRC and going, "We are going to make a change. We're going to improve things for the better." So yeah, the Fair Cobalt Alliance has kind of blossomed, I suppose, as a result of the likes of that. So yeah, cobalt is very much something that's under control, but is being phased out of EVs anyway. Bear in mind that cobalt is used, however, to refine petrol and diesel. So there's actually more cobalt used in a petrol or diesel car than there is in a lithium iron phosphate, which is cobalt-free battery that you'd find in a standard range Tesla Model 3 or MG4.
Geez, it's fascinating to put some of these points to bed quite quickly. So once we've got these raw materials out of the ground, we've got the key basic chemistry to put together a battery. How do we go from refined lithium and mined cobalt through to an assembled cell that ends up on a production line to go into a vehicle? There must be multiple manufacturing steps, multiple factories, and of course there's this nice new term which is super in the press at the moment around gigafactories and potentially the lack of gigafactories here in the UK.
Well, the biggest step is going to be the gigafactory itself, or the battery factory in general, whatever scale that may be. So what you will do is you will take your active material powders. So you'll take your graphite, get some lithium in there, your lithium heavy metal oxides for the other electrode, and then you will make them into a slurry, probably with a solvent called NMP, which is it's not a particularly nice solvent, but what we do is we'll recapture it and use it later, as I'll describe in a minute. And what you're doing is you're going to be coating that wet slurry onto a reel of copper foil for the negative electrode, the anode, and aluminium foil for the cathode, the positive electrode. And once you've coated this to a very fine level, probably with like lasers checking the actual, the consistency of the depth of that layer, or the thickness of that layer right across the entire electrode reel that you've got, that reel is going to continue to go through several high temperature ovens, which are going to dry that active material, that slurry onto the actual metal foil. And then the solvent that's evaporated is recovered and used later on. But those ovens take a lot of energy to operate. In fact, it's almost half of a gigafactory's energy requirements is the drying stage there, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So then once you've got your reel that's all been wound up with the active material on it, you will then cut those to size. So for pouch cells, which in automotive applications, I mean, they can take various shapes and forms, but imagine an A4 sheet of paper that's a bit kind of fatter than that. And then you are basically stamping out that size of electrode. And then you're stacking them with a plastic separator, plastic film separator between them. So it's a stacking mechanism, and that's, if anything, a bit of a bottleneck in the production process because it takes a while to stack that. The other thing you can do is you can cut big long strips of them and you can create what's called a jelly roll. That's what you get in a cylindrical cell and many prismatic chunky box cells. And that's where, yeah, you've got your positive electrode, your negative electrode, the film of separator, and then you just wind it up like a kitchen roll. And obviously that just gets stuffed into the can from there. So that's a very high throughput process with two, obviously one of each positive and negative electrode sheets, as opposed to lots of them all stacked and then welded together on the tabs, which then connect to the terminals, which go to the outside world. Anyway, once you've done that, you'll fill it with electrolyte. You'll give it a couple of formation cycles, which is where you're basically conditioning the cell so that it's ready for heading out into the application it's going to go to. If it's a pouch cell, it's basically going to be in a laminated aluminium bag, so that'll swell a bit because it'll gas a bit during formation. So what you'll do is you'll degas that and seal it again, and then it's pretty much good to go after you've left it in a warehouse for a few weeks, just to make sure it's not done anything silly, to make sure the voltage remains stable, it's not accidentally self-discharging itself. That might mean there's an imperfection in the cell. But I was saying about the high temperature ovens, there are processes that are being continuously developed to improve the efficiency and the throughput of gigafactories. And one of those is dry electrode coating. This is something that Tesla has been making the headlines about because it bought Maxwell a while ago, which has dry coating technology. They're now trying to apply that not to the ultracapacitors that Maxwell made, but to lithium ion cells. And that means you don't need that solvent at the beginning. You don't need those ovens, and you've just saved about half of the energy costs and a bit of time in the process as well.
This is fabulous. So you kind of like described very simply how to put a battery together and then stick it in a can, very simply. And we're sat here in the UK with this big patch of land that potentially could have had British Volt on it. We've got a number of other sort of smaller battery capabilities here in the UK. Where are the countries in the world that are getting really good at battery manufacturing? Who are the big names we should be aware of, and why is there not more in the UK?
So, I mean, South Korea quite quickly stole the march in terms of cell development for electric vehicle applications in the early days. I mean, Japan was arguably the country that perfected the lithium ion cell. Sony was the first to commercialize them back in 1992, if I recall correctly. But, we obviously saw the likes of the Nissan Leaf. So that was Nissan's own cell chemistry that was developed. Well, it was AESC, Automotive Energy Supply Corporation. Nissan was involved in that. And then Panasonic, of course, they had their lithium-ion cylindrical cell factory in Japan as well. But then we started to see LG Chem. We started to see the far more impressive, in my books, SK On, formerly SK Innovation, who have incredibly high quality cells that I've not once heard of an issue with them. And yeah, I mean they are just stunningly good cells. But that said, China very quickly started to steal a march and is now arguably the leader on cell development. I mean, South Korea is still amazing, and Panasonic's obviously doing its thing with Tesla, and therefore does have very high quality cells too. But China, you've got two in particular major players, and there's loads more besides. But the two to look out for are CATL, which is the world's biggest cell manufacturer, and it's found in loads of different makes of electric vehicles, including the lithium iron phosphate cells found in the standard range Tesla Model 3. And I mean, the list is too long to go through all the EVs that have CATL cells in them. But the other one to look out for is BYD, Build Your Dreams. So what they are is a vertically integrated company, basically China's answer to Tesla. They make everything from the cell right the way up to the complete electric vehicle and charging infrastructure. And as it transpires, actually, one of my former PhD colleagues, Rong Hao, is back over in China at BYD, heading up all of their cell development. So these incredible Blade LFP cells, which are going to be coming to the UK very soon in the BYD Atto 3, which is a compact SUV, they are not only cobalt free and very ethical, they're incredibly safe. You could drill through them with a metal drill bit and it would barely get hot. There'd be no gas venting. It would just be mildly warm, which is incredibly safe for a lithium ion cell. And that would have been him that spearheaded that operation. So, needless to say, I'm immensely proud of my PhD buddy.
So let me ask you kind of another rudimentary question. You listed more companies than the average person could possibly know or understand. So if you're an EV buyer, user, you said these guys do a great one, these ones have a better safe one. How does the consumer who doesn't have the background you have figure out what's a good story for them? How are they finding out what battery to lean to or who makes a good battery? What defines a good battery from a consumer's point of view?
So basically, if you want to find out who's making the cells in a particular vehicle, you're going to have to do a bit of digging or ask people in the know. It's rare for a manufacturer to actually state up front, yeah, these cells are from this manufacturer. There's certainly some brands that I would go for over others, but that said, a lot of it comes down to how you use those cells and how you put them into a battery pack and how you manage them, how you cool them, how high you take the voltages on charge, etc. And some car manufacturers are brilliant at making batteries last a very long time, and others, I mean, don't get me wrong, EV batteries of all descriptions are outlasting expectations, but there's others that will do the distance even more so than than other brands. So yeah, what's a good story for an EV driver? I mean, most batteries have something like an 8-year, 100,000 mile warranty on them. So if you're buying new, you've not really got anything to worry about. If you're buying used, mileage is generally just a number to these machines, but you want to make sure that if you're going to be doing high mileage and constantly rapid charging, that the vehicle has an active thermal management system. In other words, it cools its batteries during charging and driving. The Nissan Leaf, despite being around for over a decade, Nissan has still not put active thermal management in the Leaf, but they have increased the size of the battery, which has resulted in increased heat dissipation during rapid charging. The 40 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf undergoes what's called rapid gate because the battery gets so hot during charging and it has no way of cooling itself that the battery management system has to reduce the maximum power that it can take on during charge by something like 50%. So that's not ideal if you're doing long journeys or you're constantly double shifting it as a taxi. Meanwhile, most other EVs on the market have a liquid-based cooling system which will deal with those cell temperatures, get them right back down to ambient temperatures, and it just means that vehicle can keep on going.
What about just, we're in winter right now and coldness. So one of the uses I think is you want to heat your battery up to get a better charge, and that uses a lot of energy from what I'm told. And once again, I apologize for my ignorance here, but how does that work? So you said one of the problems is getting too hot. What do I do when I live like here in Switzerland? I live up in the mountains and it's just freaking cold.
So, if to be honest, it's really only when it comes to rapid charging when you're out and about, and you're basically treating it like a petrol pump for electric vehicles to quickly take on what you need and move on. That's the only time that cold temperatures are really going to affect your charging speeds. Because if you're plugging in to a destination charge point, a 7 kilowatt kind of wall box sort of thing, like at your home, at a hotel, at whatever the destination is you may be going to, your work, etc. If the car is going to be parked there for a while anyway, then it doesn't matter if the charging speed is relatively slow because it's still going to pull 7 kilowatts. I mean, to put it into perspective, my Tesla, if it's freezing cold overnight, I mean properly bitterly cold, and the vehicle has not been used during the day, but I've told it actually I need you to charge overnight on my cheap off-peak tariff because I'll need you tomorrow, then it starts off pulling 1 amp out of 32, which multiplied by 230 volts gives you 7 kilowatts. So it just kind of goes, is it safe to do this? Right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat the battery just a little bit. Right, that's fine. And now I'll ramp up the current, and now I'll ramp it up again. And within about 15 minutes, it's up to full power. But bearing in mind I was sleeping then anyway, and I was only going to need about 3 or 4 hours worth of charging, that's fine. Where the issue lies is when you need to thump considerably more power than that into the vehicle. If you've parked at, say, a hotel overnight, but you've not plugged in, and then you plan to use the Tesla supercharger or the Ionity high power charger right next to the hotel, and it's been freezing cold overnight, you're going to see a massive reduction in charge speed until that battery heats itself up, either through an inbuilt heater in the car that's heating the battery, or just through the dissipation of heat from the cells themselves. So they're basically acting as their own heating elements. So yeah, you will see a serious issue with reduced charging speeds unless the battery has been given sufficient time to preheat, which is what Tesla does. If you put in a supercharger as the destination, it will preheat the battery en route to the destination, heats it up to 50 degrees C, which you do not want to have a battery at for a sustained period of time. But the higher the temperature, the lower the internal resistance and the more power you can thump into it. So what it will then do is it will moderate that temperature during supercharging, and as soon as the supercharging is complete, it really slams on that cooling system and brings those temperatures right back down. It's fine to have the battery at that temperature for a short period of time, but if you do a Leaf rapid gate and you leave it hot and it's just naturally dissipating without actively having that heat wicked away after the charging session, that's when you start to degrade your battery faster. But as I said, the vast majority of modern EVs do take care of that. But do beware, there are some EVs which do not do preheating particularly well. Earlier entry-level Hyundai Ionic 5s, they are notorious because they don't have a heat pump in them, they don't have the ability to heat the battery, and in winter, people were complaining they were only getting 30 kilowatts on a charger that should easily have been giving them at least 150. If it was summer, the same car would do 150 kilowatts. But the middle spec Ionic 5 and the top spec, which had a heat pump, that wasn't a problem. It heated its battery, it charged quickly.
So this is opening up the whole ecosystem of, the battery's central to the vehicle's movement. We love the idea of charging at home overnight. That's absolutely fabulous. But clearly, rapid charging vehicles is something which the mindset of a petrol and diesel driver starts from because it's so similar to a petrol station. you've kind of touched on a few things, and the whole Nissan Rapid Gate all came about from one individual learned the hard way driving a Nissan a long distance, charged it, rapid charged it, great. Tried to do it again, didn't really work out. So people have discovered a lot of this stuff as they've gone on their journey, and there's a lot of, in many ways, conflicting information around should you rapid charge, shouldn't you rapid charge, how much should you rapid charge. Can you tell us a bit more about the impacts of rapid charging on battery degradation, and then we'll dive into the world of the chargers themselves.
So yeah, I mean, in theory, the more that you rapid charge an electric vehicle, or rather, the higher the power that you use to charge it, or to be even more technically correct, the higher the C rate, the currents being delivered to it in amps over the capacity of the battery in ampere hours, or the power in kilowatts over the energy in kilowatt hours. The higher that C rate, then the harder the lifespan is going to be on that battery. But with modern battery thermal management systems and battery management systems, we're seeing that you can actually put in some pretty high charging power. And of course, modern chemistries as well that are more resilient to it. You can put in higher charging power on a more regular basis and it doesn't affect the battery too badly. Plus, it depends on the vehicle, because it could be that, yes, I mean, this is where C rates are important, because yes, 150 kilowatts sounds like a scary number. But if a Tesla Model S is 100 kilowatt hours battery, then that's 1.5 C. Whereas, if you're doing 50 kilowatts on a car that's maybe 22, 24 kilowatt hours, a city car, then that's 2C. So it's actually harder on the battery than it was supercharging that Tesla. So yeah, it's all relative, and it also does depend on the chemistry to a degree. But unless your battery is not actively cooled and it's routinely getting very hot, and that just, as I said, accelerates that degradation process, then I wouldn't be so worried about routinely rapid charging a vehicle that has a proper cooled thermal management system. That said, it's probably a better use of your time to plug in the car on an AC slower charge point and charge it whilst you are not using that vehicle. Obviously, if you're out and about and you need that quick top up to get to your destination, that's what rapid chargers are for. Use it. If you don't have any access to a home charge point, work charge point, or an on street or public car park type 2 charge point near you, and you need to use a rapid charger, then so be it. But chances are you're not going to be using that rapid charger like 3 or 4 times a day or anything. However, that said, again, testament to modern EV batteries. Let's have a look at Ember, who have intercity electric coaches that run from Dundee to Edinburgh and back on one charge. 130 miles of hilly motorway, they arrive back with about 30 to 40% of the battery left in the tank. They then plug into a 150 kilowatt rapid charger. Admittedly, that's probably somewhere about 0.6, 0.7 C when you consider the size of the battery on the buses. But they're doing that constantly, because it's Dundee, Edinburgh, back on charge, Edinburgh, back on charge, and it is just constant 24 hours a day. The first vehicles they had clocked up 200,000 miles, 320-ish thousand kilometers in the first year of operation, and didn't skip a beat. They're going great. They're still going great. The batteries are still in excellent condition.
So, what happens once the battery has gone through its useful life? So, let's say we don't recycle it and put it into a 60% use in a warehouse somewhere to use
Hmm.
storage. Let's say we actually want to get rid of this battery. So, we've used up its useful life. What do we do with it? How do we recycle it and turn it back into something useful again?
So
And
there's
and, and
three. Oh, sorry,
really
yeah.
really keen for understand whose responsibility is it to look after that battery.
That's a very good one. Now, arguably, it's the automotive manufacturer's responsibility to look after that. There's many places that do have regulations that say you need to deal with this battery that's in your vehicle responsibly. And we're already seeing, particularly Nissan and Renault, amongst others, taking an active, and BMW actually, basically most of the car manufacturers are already taking an active interest in finding ways to responsibly reuse and extend the lifespan of, and then recycle those EV batteries in various different inventive ways and means that are genuinely constructive. But when it comes to actually recycling a battery that is completely dead, which will, in all honesty, it'll likely be decades down the line for most of these modern EV batteries we have today, in a vehicle that's just rolled off a production line today, I would expect a lifespan of at least 300,000 miles, probably 500,000 at least. out the battery. And that's being conservative because the lifespan's getting better and better. That's until the end of its supposedly useful life as an EV battery, which is 70% state of health, which in other words is 70% of its capacity today versus when it was new. That is probably still loads for an EV. Like a Kia e-Niro, that's still almost 200 miles worth of range, for example, more than enough for most people. But in terms of how we actually go about recycling it, and I feel it's actually important to have had that preamble just to point out this is not going to be something that happens in like 3 or 5 years after a car is made. So there's three options available. There's the old school pyrometallurgical recycling technique. You basically stick it in a furnace and you melt it down. Cobalt's worth a lot of money, you recover that. Copper's worth a lot of money, you recover that. Lithium, actually not worth that much, ends up in a slag alongside the burnt plastic and the graphite, and even the aluminium ends up in the slag. You're recovering between 40 and 60% of the materials. Not great, uses high temperature furnaces, quite energy intensive. The other thing that we're seeing people doing now, the likes of Li-Cycle, for example, and an interesting company called Arabat that's developing a version of this that's made from organic waste fruit materials. I'll come back to them in a minute. You've got your hydrometallurgical, so you're basically dissolving the electrodes in a strong acid, and that's leaching out the active materials that can be reprocessed and stuffed into a new battery. So very low energy, but yes, you have to deal with acids. Ooh, scary. Arabat, as I said, is making it out of waste citrus fruit. So that's a pretty clever way to go about it. But Li-Cycle is arguably one of the most well-established recycling companies. Redwood Materials, if I recall correctly, has some sort of link, at least through its senior staff, to Tesla. I think there's been quite a few ex-Tesla staff who've set that up and worked at it at some stage or another. They're all about the recycling as well. But one of the most interesting developments that's coming out of research labs in the UK, the ReLib project, universities of Birmingham and Leicester, they've developed direct recycling. So you take your electrode sheets and you put them in a bath of very mild acid, barely any acid there at all. And it's ultrasonic delamination. So you're applying basically ultrasound to this, and you are shuggling the active material off of the electrode sheet. So you end up with a very clean sheet of foil metal, whether it's copper or aluminium, and then you end up with the active material still intact, which you then spruce up basically, almost kind of sprinkle some fairy dust on it and slap it into a new cell. And what we've found with this incredibly high throughput, low energy, no nasty acid sort of technique is that, the lab studies have shown so far, the cells that they've made using the recycled recovered material from direct recycling actually outperform the original cells that they're made from when those cells were new. So it's like twice cooked chips at a gastropub. It's that's very exciting. So that's currently in the process of a major UK R&D project, and ultimately the aim is to commercialize that and to scale it up. And that means that even for cell chemistries like lithium iron phosphate, that are, if you think about it, are largely made of rust because it's iron, it's phosphorus, it's not cobalt, it's not expensive stuff. Even they become economically viable to recycle.
That's fabulous. My own career began up in Dounreay where they recycled nuclear waste, which was a hydrometallurgical process, but radioactive as well. So it's a pretty unpleasant process. The idea of like effectively putting in an ultrasound bath and pulling out clean sheets of metal sounds absolute genius. However, I'm hoping the UK really does work on commercializing it. Can we go back to the charging experience? You talked in quite a lot of detail about some of the pros and cons of how a car charges, but 99% of the time, the guy in their electric van standing in the car park tells me I'm not getting the rate of charge that it says on the piece of paper when I got sold this vehicle. Now, you've started to describe some of the elements that can go wrong that mean you don't get that rate of charge. But, why is that van driver not getting the rate of charge that they expect when they turn up at their charger?
It very much depends on the charger. So there's the absolute newbie issue, which is where they've forgotten to remove the bung for the two CCS DC pins. So CCS, combined charging system, you've got the kind of D-shaped thing, which is type 2. That's your AC, your slow stuff. But then CCS has this kind of ugly 2-pin extension at the bottom of it, and that's what thumps in hundreds of kilowatts of power potentially if your car will take it. And the way that these have been designed is like a separate rubber bung that to the AC one that keeps the DC pins weatherproof and dry until you need them. And a lot of people don't actually realize that bung is there, that those pins are there. So when an EV veteran comes along and just goes and it removes that bung, they're like, oh, that explains so much, thank you. And then they plug in the correct one and they start getting a fast charge. We've already covered battery might be too cold. We've already covered battery might be too hot. Those are exceptional circumstances, and certainly if you've been doing a lot of driving today, that battery should be at an ideal temperature, I should say, for rapid charging. But it very much will depend on the charger in that case. So if you have a vehicle that has a 400-volt battery, which is standard for electric vehicles at the moment, some of them go higher than that, some of them a little bit higher, some of them up to 800 volts. And you go up to a charger that says maybe something like up to 120 kilowatts, um, then what you might find is, yeah, all well and good if you have an 800-volt battery, because power is current times voltage, and your voltage is 800 volts. But the maximum current that this charger can provide down its CCS cable is 200 amps. So that means that you'd obviously max out the charger's like overall power supply, so 120 kilowatts, because 800 times 200 is 160 kilowatts, but obviously the charger's limited to 120. So you would max that out if you had the likes of a Hyundai Ioniq 5, for example, which has an 800-volt battery. But if you had a Tesla, which generally has about a 400-volt battery, you would probably find 400 times 200 is 80 kilowatts. So that's why you're not getting the charging speed you're expecting. The other thing is that some chargers actually share their power modules. Either they'll split their power modules between two vehicles charging off of one charger, or they'll be twinned with the charger next to it and they'll share the power modules between them. So if you go to an older Tesla supercharger site, a V2 supercharger, which is recognizable because it has CCS and the proprietary Tesla supercharger socket on them as well, or plugs on them as well. Um, those ones are rated at between 120 and 150 kilowatts, but they're installed in pairs. So you'll see on the actual chargers, they'll say 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, etc. And they will split those power modules between them if another vehicle goes on to A and another one goes on to B. So that's resulted in Tesla superchargers having what's known as urinal etiquette. You never squeeze up next to someone and use the supercharger next to them because you half your charging speed. But I mean, that said, we're starting to see far more advanced chargers now that will share power modules across an entire site, which greatly reduces the chances of you actually having your charging session that badly interrupted. And they will share them in a much kind of smaller number of kilowatts per power module as well. Perfect example is Kempower, who have a design that shares power modules in 25 kilowatt segments. So if you have a Nissan Leaf on one of these dispensers, one of these chargers they have, it's pulling 50 kilowatts, but you could do 200 kilowatts. You'll get 200 kilowatts on your charger, no bother. And chances are, if you're at a big charging hub, not everybody's going to be pulling full power simultaneously. Some people, even with fast charging cars, will be at a higher state of charge, so the power will be tapering off by that point anyway. So those power modules can be reassigned to vehicles that need them more, and that will give them a faster charge. We're starting to see this. Not everyone's using them though, but we're starting to see these coming in across Europe and I believe the US as well. But certainly in the UK, we're seeing the likes of Osprey using these at big charging hubs, and that's good to see because that genuinely means people will get the fastest charge possible, and it limits that headache of it's because power is being split amongst other vehicles.
So at some point, this becomes mature, and you don't have to think about it or know about it. Like you said, the charging infrastructure will just do this, or your car will do that. How married is the battery tech to the charging infrastructure? Is there a relationship there to what battery and what charging infrastructure I need to work with?
So, to be honest, as long as your vehicle has a CHAdeMO or a CCS or a Type 2 charge port, it doesn't really matter what the charger is. It's more about it's less about the cell chemistry and it's more about the cell voltage, or sorry, the battery voltage, I should say. 800-volt batteries will pretty much pull full power that's available from any charger, because power is current times voltage, and you're overcoming the current limitations of skinnier cables on less impressive high power chargers. Some high power chargers have very big fat cables that can dump 500 amps, and that means that lower voltage cars that can take a high power will get a higher power on that charger. We're gradually seeing 800-volt batteries becoming more appealing. I think we'll probably see a kind of greater adoption of those, certainly in the premium segment, for the people who are munching up motorway mileage, and they'll need a quick charge whenever they get it. We might find that 400-volt batteries remain in vogue for your kind of smaller city cars and so on, where it maybe doesn't matter quite as much. But in terms of the actual battery chemistry, it really doesn't matter. It's the car's battery management system that's handling how much power can be taken, etc. And it's more going to be to do with the especially now that we're seeing lithium-ion cells being so robust, and upcoming chemistries like sodium ion and so on probably being able to withstand a half decent C rate. We'll see that rapid charging at fairly respectable speeds should be fairly commonplace going forwards. It would be very surprising to see any new EVs being released with less than 100 kilowatts charging capability, certainly within the next couple of years.
So one of the things that's seen in the press is the danger of EVs and battery tech, of my car catching on fire, me getting into a bad crash, and I'm never going to get on my Tesla alive. Um, how much is this myth? How much is reality? What's what here?
So, particularly with a Tesla, which will have very high energy density NCA cells, or your lithium iron phosphate, but we'll come back to them. We're looking at the kind of long range Teslas and the Tesla Model S's. When you've got your kind of cobalt containing chemistries, if you do really, really stupid stuff to them, like, actually properly gouge through them with a metal implement, then when you internally short them, they will heat up very quickly. That'll kind of cause gassing of the electrolyte, and it may well catch fire. But bear in mind that that's made up of thousands of individual cells, and it's going to take a while for that heat to propagate to neighboring cells. So it starts off like a couple of mini fireworks, and it might continue to propagate, but you've got a thermal management system that's going to be going, oh wow, something's not right, slam on the cooling system, get that going full power, and then we'll try and extract that heat before it actually leads to more of a kind of chain reaction. So it takes something very, very bad to happen to even the more kind of um, fire prone, and I say that like in a relative term. Generally EV batteries do not catch fire. If you look at the latest stats from I think it was the American fire protection agencies and so on, they had a look at the number of vehicle fires per 100,000 vehicles for gasoline, for hybrid, and for pure electric. And pure electric per 100,000 vehicles had by far the least number of battery fires. Gas cars were right up there, and hybrids were actually even more, because you've not only got the wiring harness and the kind of possibility of electrical faults and things, but you've also got your very, very flammable tank of liquid fuel that's just sitting there waiting to engulf you in a fireball. So yeah, hybrids are actually a bit of a faff, whereas EVs are far safer in that kind of fire safety regard. Yeah, so basically, where does all this lead us to? Having worked in abuse chambers at battery labs before, and having accidentally set a Tesla Model S cell into thermal runaway, it took a good 10 minutes, and that was after I'd properly butchered that cell, for it to actually start jetting about inside this glove box like a fireman's hose sort of thing. It was starting to smoke a little bit. It was bubbling electrolyte out of it. It was boiling itself, basically. But it just sat there for about 10 minutes, to the point that my colleague and I stopped filming it on our phone, because we were like, it's not going to do anything. And then, of course, as soon as we stopped that, it did that kind of mad whoosh. It was like, oh, that would have made a good video. Anyway, the point is that that took ages, by which point the car's very sensitive battery management system, thermal sensors, and so on will say, terribly sorry, there appears to be something a bit wrong with the battery. We would strongly advise you to pull over and get out in a safe location. Whereas a petrol car, if you rupture the fuel tank, it's just going to say, psst, psst, guess what? Kaboom. And there's a really good video, not video, sorry, a really good picture that illustrates this, of a head-on crash between a Tesla and a petrol car in Luxembourg. The Tesla is up on the grass verge looking very sorry for itself, but it's not on fire. The petrol car is a fireball. I know which one I'd rather be in. But you've also got new chemistries coming online and already being seen in electric cars, like lithium iron phosphate, where you have to do something incredibly stupid to get that to catch fire. Yes, it'll get hot if it's shorted or punctured. Yes, it might vent gas outside the vehicle. There's no way it would vent into the vehicle unless you'd spectacularly mangle it. And that would take some doing because there's a lot of crash protection structure around the battery. But generally speaking, a lithium iron phosphate cell will not catch fire. And I know because my colleagues and I have tried. It's, yeah, genuinely, it's the only one. It was the only one that didn't have cobalt in it in a series of tests that were done at one of my previous places I worked. And it was the only one that vented gas but didn't catch fire in an oxygen-rich environment. So yeah, it's generally a safer cell. And then of course the BYD blade cells that I referred to earlier, they just they don't even vent gas; they barely get warm. Same with lithium titanate, which inherently, if there's a short within the cell, the lithium titanate actually self-passivates. It goes from being incredibly highly conductive to incredibly passivating, and inherently stops thermal runaway from happening. I don't know if that's by accident or by design. I believe it's the former. But yeah, it's a fantastic chemistry from a safety perspective. So yeah, bearing in mind that a typical EV will give you about 3 times as much warning as a petrol car that something horrible is going to go wrong to it in terms of time to escape the vehicle. Yes, a battery fire might take a while to put out because there's lots of individual cells that might pop next, but it's genuinely, from a passenger safety perspective, so much easier to escape than a petrol car with a ruptured fuel tank. So yeah, genuinely the safety side of things, and also the likelihood of the vehicle catching fire in the first place, EVs win hands down versus petrol cars for safety.
So you've taken us on one of these incredible journeys, which has included steam cars at the start. John Goodenough and his lithium-ion cell. We've done the full mouthful of vowels around NMC, NCA, lithium titanate, lithium phosphate. We've aligned that to the vehicles to an extent that they're used in. We've dug a little bit into how you might build a gigafactory and the kind of technology that's used to actually construct a battery. We've covered off some of the major manufacturers in this space. We've gone Sony, Nissan, Panasonic, LG Chem, Cattle, BYD. We've then started to go, well, hang on, what does the consumer actually need? I think we've all had our maths tested to a certain extent on this journey. And it's quite clear that, if you've got a good grip of maths and basic physics, you're going to do well at this game. I guess, through this journey, you've shown us a lot of recycling. Mustn't forget recycling, huge piece in there. But through this journey, you've explored an enormous amount of battery technology. So normally I ask, what electric car do you drive? But I'm actually going to ask you a slightly different question, which is, when you bought your electric car, did you consider the battery chemistry and the charging rate and all of these factors that you've just taken us through as a consumer when you were buying your own vehicle?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of EVs actually. One of them is a Tesla Model S 85 from 2015. I bought it at auction with 90,000 miles on the clock, and it was genuinely the most affordable 200-mile range EV, new or used, that I could buy at the time. And yeah, I knew that the chemistry in that was going to be pretty solid, even though it was an earlier version of Tesla chemistry. For a start, it has an 8-year unlimited warranty on the unlimited mileage warranty on the battery. So I wasn't too bothered anyway, but I knew that these things were capable of clocking up serious mileage. And that when the time came to replace that pack, I would probably do so and run that EV into the ground because it's a great car. And then my other vehicle is a 30 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf, which yeah, you've got to be a bit more careful when you shop for the 30 kilowatt hour Leaf because the upper state of charge buffer, which so basically, whereas a smartphone, for example, will take the cell voltages right up to the maximum that the manufacturer of that cell says you're allowed to in the spec sheet, and then right down to the minimum, all for the sake of a few extra minutes runtime, that reduces its lifespan dramatically through degradation processes. Whereas with an electric vehicle, they block off the top and bottom few kind of millivolts. So yeah, you lose a few miles of range, but literally just a handful of miles. And that is genuinely enough to massively increase the lifespan of an electric vehicle as a result. So it's a very worthwhile trade. With the 30 kilowatt hour Leaf, they didn't quite get the upper SOC buffer right. So if it was one that's done very low mileage and has been left force fed to 100% on a home charge point all the time, then it's actually going to be degraded a wee bit versus other EVs out there on the market. But I knew the history of that one. I knew it had been well looked after, so I went with that. It's a solid, dependable second car to have. So, and in fairness, I've driven that one from Scotland down to Milton Keynes for fully charged live before a couple of years ago. And yeah, it took a few rapid charges to get there, but I genuinely arrived feeling quite refreshed at the end of it because it's a sort of 100-mile range and then it's fairly quick to charge. So yeah, even a shorter range EV is capable of going on a big adventure, but no, the Tesla chews up the motorway mileage these days. And yeah, as I say, in terms of chemistry choices, it was very much what's available, but approached with caution and know what you're buying from obviously the kind of very techie perspective. But if I was to start afresh, I would probably look at an EV that has a lithium iron phosphate battery in it. For a couple of reasons. One, no cobalt, super ethical. Two, very long lasting, very reliable. Three, even safer in an absolute worst case scenario. As I said, you'd be hard pressed to get the thing to catch fire, etc. And I just think they're from a kind of nerdy perspective, they're quite a fascinating chemistry. So yeah, that's what I would go for. Plus, energy density is not quite as high, but they've got good power density. So yeah, they can dump that power quite quickly.
Well, awesome. This has been an amazing journey. I've enjoyed this conversation. I wish we could go on much longer, but it's everything I'd hoped we'd get into. So thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I'm sure we'll get some comments from our listeners. So please add your comments, subscribe, forward this if you've enjoyed this conversation. Ewan, thanks for being our guest.
You're very welcome. And I'm just going to chuck in a quick shout out just at the end here, actually, because of course we did talk about various cell manufacturers and we talked about the demise of British Bolt. Let's not forget that Britain does still have a cell manufacturer, Ampty Power, based up in Thurso, and they're working on all sorts of incredible chemistries, including very, very high power density cells for very high performance applications and sodium ion. So you're removing lithium, you don't necessarily need cobalt in there, very ethical, all sorts of clever tricks up its sleeve from a performance perspective as well and a safety perspective. But the point is that they're going to be building a bigger factory in Dundee at a former tyre factory that's been converted into an e-mobility hub, Michelin Scotland Innovation Park, incredible place. But what we need is for private sector investment and government backing so that Amity Power can achieve its realization of building a full-scale gigafactory in the UK. They have got some incredible chemistry, they've got an incredible team, and they've already proven it at a small scale in Thurso. They'll be proving it at a medium scale in Dundee, and hopefully with the right signals, the right backing, and certainly the right management, which they do have. Amity have got brilliant management. They just need the government to get behind them because the economic opportunity of them building that gigafactory and proving themselves at a large scale speaks for itself. Let's get it done.
Thanks for sharing your passion. I hope your call out is answered. For our audience, I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as we have had making it. Please follow, subscribe, and tune in again next time for another edition of Insider's Guide to Energy EV miniseries. We look forward to it. Talk to you then.